So just to give you a little bit of a background about myself. I currently run Agile Management Office. Some of you may know me from that. In addition to doing that, I've spent about 16 years working within and around PMOs, projects, working within large businesses, small businesses, every single size business you can think of. I've had the opportunity to learn from others and work within organizations across a number of different countries, 16 countries to be specific, and across 15 different industries. So the insights that I will be sharing with you today is based on not only that particular experience, but actually the opportunity of understanding what is going on in the industry right now in those organizations. And I'll share a bit of that with you as well. My favorite place that I traveled, if anyone is curious, was Hawaii and Japan. So my promise to you today. So in today's webinar, we're going to talk about why the PMO is lagging behind delivery. Now, I think it's really important for you to understand the context as to why I believe it's lagging behind and give you some examples of that. That'll help frame the conversation for you as we move forward into the thriving part of the PMO, where I'm going to share insights, practical insights that have worked many times over that you can apply not just to your PMO, but in your teams as well. So I'll share that information with you throughout the webinar as well, once we get through the background around why PMO is lagging behind delivery. I'm going to help you to identify the key challenges through the research that I've done around the PMOs and how they're being impacted globally. That particular research is over 12 months of work, talking to practitioners, talking to professionals, academics around the world, and what we've identified as some of the key issues as of the end of last year. This webinar is based on about 12 months of research, and in the lead up to the white paper series called Is the PMO Still Fit for Purpose? You'll get a copy of that through your link today as well. But today we're going to learn about ways that we can not just survive, but thrive. So let's reinvigorate our PMOs and be creative so we can work alongside delivery as a partner, not lag behind it. And I'll also give you an opportunity for us to stay connected. So please get your pens and pads ready. There's a lot of helpful information on the way. So let me just give you some background on the story so far. Now, why is this webinar? Why the white paper? Why am I even talking about this topic? Well, like many people, I fell into project management in about 2003, and that was as a result of not being successful to get into university, so I went straight into the workforce. And I think by the time I turned 17, I'd already done 9 different jobs. The reason that's relevant is because I was always curious from an early age. I was always a problem solver, and I was always someone who naturally found ways to be resourceful. And being in PMO, it's all about being resourceful. Since 2003, my natural curiosity always had me looking for ways to be more efficient and more effective. The faster I could do something well, the sooner I could learn something new. And that was the way that I thought about things. So after 11 years in corporate, in 2012, I started my first business. And what I did was take those big business learnings and apply them to small businesses. And during my years in corporate, as I continued to work in corporate up until now, is I started seeing problems, and that problems were repeating over and over and over again. I wasn't clear why organizations were enabling inefficient and ineffective behavior and approaches and processes, despite them consistently causing them problems, enabling them to lose money and waste time. So I really wasn't sure why they continued to allow that to happen. The challenge was, and for many of you on the call who have worked as a contractor potentially, or even worked in not a senior enough level within an organization, it makes it really hard for you to make change when you're not sitting high enough in an organizational hierarchy, because you'll be challenged in making significant changes. That applies to PMOs as well. When the PMO's budget is not owned or managed by them, they actually get told what they can have and what they can use. So in 2014, I ended up setting up a global PMO for a big 4 bank, and it spanned 13 countries. Now, within this organization, I found that the processes they had in place around their PMOs was not going to cut it for what they needed to do. They had to bring on board different countries, different counting policies, different legal requirements, different project methods, different frameworks, there were so many variations. So we had to create something that would work for that type of complex situation. And that is where the approach and the ideas around Agile Management Office came into mind. I knew that the governance framework for that PMO had to be unique because of the situation. And every PMO needs to be thought about in its unique situation. So I decided that year that I was going to do something overall with that process. It was quite a lean function. The global PMO only had 3 people in it, and we were able to deliver some really good results. So it was then when I decided I was going to research and see what are the other challenges that were being faced and whether they were similar when speaking to others around the world. And it was then that the white paper came into fruition. And since then, we partnered with a university in Denmark to continue to elaborate on that further. So whether you choose to survive or thrive is entirely up to you. Nobody can tell you which way you need to go, what you're going to do, whether we're talking about in your personal life, professional life, or in your PMO. When you look at PMOs, and I think PMOs that are just surviving. Now, we know that there's a lot of statistics out there that say that PMOs typically don't survive greater than 3 to 5 years. And that is for those that actually get that far. What are some of the signs that you're living in survival mode? Well, have a look at these key points here and see if these are familiar to either your functions or functions that you've worked with. I appreciate that not everybody on the call is working in a PMO, but you've no doubt engaged with one, hired one, or supported one. One of the interesting things here is the second last point, where throughout our research, we found that many instances and many examples of teams going around their existing PMO functions because they didn't find it valuable. And they would go away and they would create pseudo functions that are almost identical to PMOs, just run slightly differently with maybe a fancier name. And they did that to go around you. If you are finding that that is happening to you or in your organization, then there's definitely a problem that you may be a sign of being in survival mode. When I think about thriving PMO, this is my definition. It's one that proactively demonstrates value and is consistently called on not just to solve problems, but to deliver insights and guidance and actively build relationships, creating advocates as a result. Now, basically everything is done with your customer's best interests in mind. Those customers become your biggest supporters and become your advocates. For example, one of our clients, who I've been working with since 2014, has consistently re-engaged us in the last 6 years, moving us from company to company because she saw the value. She's now an advocate. So you need to have someone or someones who are providing you that executive support. And you can only do that by demonstrating your value. Now, it's important that we think about not just surviving. I'm going to help you today to clearly demonstrate your value proposition so that you don't just survive, but rather you thrive. First, we're going to look at how we assess how we are really going when we think about wanting to change. But before we can do that, we need to understand what are the challenges that have been identified as a result of the 12 months research program undertaken, where we were interviewing and speaking with professionals, executives, practitioners, and academics across 7 countries. But before we do that, let's look at a real example of survival versus thriving. This is the last Blockbuster store in Oregon, USA. Blockbuster was an American-based provider of home movie and video game rental services through a video rental shop. At its peak in 2004, not that long ago, Blockbuster employed over 84,000 people worldwide. including about 58,000 in the US alone and 25,000 in other countries. It had over 9,000 stores globally, and more than half of those were in the US alone. Now, they did try to evolve. They did try a DVD by mail, streaming, video on demand, and a cinema theatre approach, but customers didn't see or understand well enough their value proposition. So now, this last Blockbuster store is just surviving. Then we compare it to Netflix. Netflix is an all-American media services provider and a production company headquartered in California. It was founded in 1997 by Reed Hastings and Mark Randolph in California. In 2018, so 2 years ago, it made over $15 billion in revenue. And at last check, it had over 150 million subscribers globally. Now, one of the founders, Reed Hastings, is often quoted saying that he decided to set up Netflix after being fined $40 at a Blockbuster store because he returned a movie late. I'm not sure how true that is. That being said, in the year 2000, when Netflix was just about 300,000, now remember, at the moment, they're over 150 million. When they were 300,000 subscribers and they relied heavily on the US Postal Service, they were losing money and they offered to be acquired by Blockbuster for $50 million. They proposed that Netflix would be renamed Blockbuster.com and actually be able to take on their business. But needless to say, Blockbuster declined that offer. Netflix is a pure example of identifying ways to evolve, not just the way we watch movies, but took the initiative to make it possible, now introducing a number of different services such as their production company. So now let's look at specific history of the PMO. Now, as part of the white paper series, we took a look back at the history of PMO and where it has come to be today. Throughout the research, we identified that we only needed to speak to certain people, and we actually managed to speak to people across 7 countries and find recurring themes across that. But as a result of all of the work that was done there, we identified that the term project office dates back to the early 1800s. That was as far back as we had found. And it was originally set up as a way to drive productivity, to support the significant number of projects as a form of control, where the consequence of that meant that only limited guidelines were offered. Whereas in the early 1930s, it was more about supporting projects. Then in the 1960s, we started seeing the rise of the enterprise PMO, and that was there to help align projects to organizational strategy. As the concept of the PMO grew, so did the need to provide standards and to evolve the way that the function as it's known today actually exists. And you can see that evolution, but it's kind of stagnated. When we look at the history of project management, we think about how much project management has evolved. This is just a brief history to show you. You can see there's been a lot of new methods, approaches, institutions, practices that have been developed. The amount of money spent on project management every year is in the billions. But as project delivery methods continue to evolve, they continue to be scrutinized, measured, assessed, and think about all of the post-implementation reviews that happen on your projects or projects that you know. Despite all of that work and all of that effort, according to a study by BIA Canada, across 50,000 projects, they found that 70% were still failing. But how does this evolution of project management compare to that of the PMO? Well, here's a comparison. When we look at the PMO evolution against project management, you can see that as project delivery methods continue to evolve, the PMO tends to lag. In fact, any sign of PMO evolution has been embedded or referenced within the project management practice. So I asked the question, Could the PMO be contributing to the high failure rates of projects? Now, there's not been a study on this yet, but when you think about it, unlike projects, PMOs are typically not a focus area for executives because it doesn't appear to immediately impact a company's profitability. So what are the challenges? Before we start talking improvements, let's do a review of the key challenges based on the highest ranked through the research and those challenges and how they are facing PMOs. As we move forward, we'll consider how these challenges may apply to you, your PMOs, or PMOs that you've dealt with in the past. And let's cover them off briefly now. You can read full details about the challenges in the white paper. Governing in Agile ways. From an agility perspective and being prepared for Agile, remember, Agile has been around for almost 20 years. It's not new, but the reason it's becoming more of an issue for PMOs is the obvious disconnect between what the delivery teams need and what the PMOs are actually doing. I ran a survey with the CIO Executive Council, and they agreed that 83% of them were dissolving or resizing their PMOs in response to Agile. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the PMOs are not doing a good job. Some instances they might not be, but obviously what this represents is the value is not being seen if the CIOs are willing to do that. PMOs are being dissolved. PMOs also are often reactively driven by the needs of senior management. And then also the increase in new ways of working actually is leading to new ways of wasting. Some of our larger clients have admitted adding layers and layers of frameworks and governance on top of old, outdated governance frameworks. It's actually very ineffective. The second problem, organizational misalignment. Think about this. Where does your PMO sit? How many times have we seen the PMO location different depending on the organization? Maybe you're reporting to a CIO. Maybe you're reporting to a program manager. Maybe you're a standalone PMO. Despite being called out as an issue in surveys globally, these surveys don't explore the reasons for the misalignment. So we need to think about bridging these gaps and looking at the picture of how your governance and delivery fit together. Because remember, PMOs don't sit high enough in the hierarchy to instigate strategic change or drive project alignment to strategic objectives. For many of the people we spoke to, that was evident. Stakeholder satisfaction. One of the many reasons for PMO's establishment is to enhance satisfaction of stakeholders, both up the line and down the line. However, we found that senior management are often significantly unsatisfied with projects after establishing PMOs. Many reasons for this. Not only do executives often request a PMO but don't support them or back them enough, but also because there is a different perspective on what a PMO should do or what it will do. And as a result of the trauma from unsuccessful attempts in the past, it often ends up having a result where these managers will go off and create their own pseudo functions, whichever name they want to give them. Then we think about the delivery disconnect. This is where PMOs are often seen as process police, only do things to appease up the line executives rather than support core functions. Project managers and delivery teams don't understand the requirement for all of the additional paperwork, stifling their creativity, they say. There's also an assumption that when a project is going wrong, that it needs more governance, more reporting, and more layers of bureaucracy. There's clearly a disconnect between what the PMO is doing and what the organizations need it to do. Lack of efficiency. That is PMOs within organizations working in isolation of each other. Despite establishing enterprise PMOs, which is supposed to be the parent of all PMOs, they're often there to serve executives, focusing on high-level policy setting, and so on. And then the lack of training. Does a lack of training contribute to negative perceptions of PMO? Yes. Internal knowledge and learnings aren't being harnessed, and existing training is developed with delivery in mind, not focused on or thinking about the PMO. And then we look at the value proposition. The value proposition, the last one of our key problems. is where, despite best intentions, the PMO is the first to go when cost cutting becomes a priority. And that's evident in a number of different surveys by multiple different organizations, including KPMG. So, are you ready to thrive? Let's get into it. Number one, we need to think about understanding our customer. Now, that sounds really, really simple and really, really straightforward. But fundamentally, there's a lot more underneath the surface when we think about the customer. Your customer and yourself, you might want to evolve, but you actually don't know where to start. And that's normal. It's normal to think about all the things that you want to do that you need to do. In the time that you're trying to reactively respond to situations around you, but also wanting to take the time to make changes. So some suggestions. First of all, define a clear and accountable stakeholder to support your function long term. Once you've got an executive on board who can understand what you're trying to achieve, understands the value proposition, they will be able to support you and back you for the long term. But in order to do that, you need to help them understand how you are going to make sure that what you are delivering is valuable for your stakeholders. One of those ways is coming up with a plan and a path to do so. For example, seeking and accepting constructive feedback. So doing so, just like projects where they go and complete post-implementation reviews, well, PMOs should be asking for feedback regularly. You also need to be thinking about it from the customer's perspective. You need to also create a visual way of identifying the feedback they request and actually sharing that feedback as well. And one of the things I didn't mention is it's so important to have a view on who your stakeholders are. Projects create stakeholder matrices all the time, and it's really important that you do one for your PMO as well, because you too need to liaise with your stakeholders, and having a clear view on that so everyone in your PMO can be on the same page is really important. Number two, measuring what matters. So when we think about measuring what matters, what does that involve? Well, first of all, what level of maturity would you say your PMO is today? Ponder that question and think about it. Are you able to answer that question honestly and truthfully? I don't think that many PMOs can honestly say where they are in terms of maturity. And that's not necessarily for lack of trying, but maybe they don't have the opportunity and the visibility around what maturity level that they are up to. So it's something to consider, because even the best PMOs really should have a view on where they're up to so they know where they need to go. Just as a reference, many organizations based on P3M3 assessments don't last beyond level 3. They actually get to level 3, and level 3 is a good sort of middle ground. So when you're thinking about measuring what matters, we need to think about not only the maturity, but also what are you currently doing? And what I mean by that is really, really taking a stock check, intuitively understanding and thinking about what it is that you're currently doing within your PMO. Thinking about everything that you're doing enables you to basically take an amnesty of everything that's going on, to review every process in your PMO. Take the time to review every process in your PMO today. Understand its current state. Are the things that are incomplete? Are there things that are in progress? Are there things that you maybe have on a backlog? Identify where it starts and where it ends. Think about who it's going to benefit. How many touch points does your process have? What are the inputs and the outputs of that process? And then think about what is the benefit of that process. And then thinking about how it fits within your organization ecosystem. Now, what this means is, just because you may be running a PMO in a specific team or a specific area or a specific department, you will no doubt have touch points across your enterprise. Your finances will link to finance. Your resourcing processes and policies will link to HR. The way that you assess projects risks will link back to corporate risk. So think about, where does your process fit? Does it solely fit within your project, your program, or your portfolio? Or is it something that currently aligns to organizational policies and procedures? What would happen if you stopped doing these? Write that down. because that will help you work out what you're doing and which of those activities will benefit the majority of your stakeholders. Because remember, the PMO is not about us as PMO managers, it's actually about our customers. Number 3 is applying a situational governance lens. The situational governance lens is important because we all know that projects are treated differently. Not every project is treated equal, neither is every PMO. So, for example, we don't assume that we know what a project is going to need. In some organizations, they use a standardized methodology that is for all projects regardless of size. And then you've got small initiatives that only take a matter of weeks to resolve, and they're following processes that usually are applied to large programs of work. So we need to think about governance with a situational lens, thinking about what is needed for that specific situation and being flexible and agile in our approach. Because when we think about PMOs, we need to make sure that we're setting them up and they always have a clear purpose. You don't set up a PMO until you've understood its purpose and you've documented it and you've socialized it. Don't establish processes without consulting your customers. Make sure that you invite your customers to co-design solutions that work. If they are co-designing solutions, and that may not involve very much more than a few meetings or a few sessions or a showcase, but inviting them along to contribute means that they're more likely to accept and adopt those processes. Ultimately, good PMOs are not lucky. They are proactive and they're purposefully co-designing beautiful solutions for their stakeholders. Being agnostic with delivery. Now, when we think about delivery, we need to be aware that majority of what we've seen in the research and speaking to organizations globally is that often the PMO would replicate or try to imitate the delivery framework that the delivery teams are using. For example, in an organization where they're deciding to apply PMBOK methodology, for example, they will create a methodology, a hybrid version of that method that helps them to run their projects. What does the PMO do? The PMO then goes along and creates processes and procedures that align directly to PMBOK. Then move forward a few months or a few years later, potentially, that same company went along and decided they were going to integrate SAFe, an agile type of framework for their business, moving from PMBOK to SAFe. What that meant was the PMO had to start all over again and now bringing them processes and procedures to match SAFe. Now, this is a true story and it happens very frequently, and it's happening more so now with the rise of Agile. So when we think about being agnostic of delivery, well, governance itself is not a straight line. There are many assumptions that governance is waterfall in nature, but it isn't always waterfall in nature. It's actually not. PMOs don't need to follow project methodologies. They need to create their own frameworks. They need to do that so they can avoid lagging behind delivery every time delivery decides they want to make a change, and then forcing the PMO to create new frameworks, methods, and processes rather than tweak what they've got to evolve with the customer. Developing processes based on good governance that complement, not stifle delivery. For example, one client that we spoke to in Ireland decided to move to more agile ways of working. They brought in a large consultancy that came in and started helping them and coaching them into running their projects with an agile flair. That meant that they shut down all their PMOs. They eliminated a significant number of staff and they had very, very little left in terms of governance at that point in time. Now, move forward a year. Due to the lack of governance that a PMO can typically bring when done well, they found that they had so many more gaps as a result of that move, they actually ended up bringing back the PMOs within a month, 12 months later. Another thing to consider, treat all issues that you get identified within your PMO or from stakeholders as improvement opportunities. So think about the opportunity to improve your function or your team or your department. This can apply to everyone and anything. In my small business, we treat every issue we get made aware of as an opportunity to learn, and we use that issue to run what we call mini projects. Think about a mini project could be something that takes as little as a day or even a week, and you batch all the problems that relate to something similar, a similar theme, and treat them all as improvement opportunities. Don't take the feedback and do nothing with it, because your stakeholders won't appreciate that. You'll see that you're going to get provided some detailed checklists. I won't go through those. Number 4, starting with your minimum value proposition. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the Agile world, you may not have heard this term before. And for those of you who haven't heard the term, it's usually referred to as MVP. Now, often service catalogs is what the PMO wants to do, what they think they can do, but they can be quite rigid sometimes. Many stakeholders don't like them because they feel that they're not going to get any support outside, the confines of that piece of paper or that, that link on the website. And if they're often poorly maintained and not easily accessible, it's hard to really demonstrate and see your value. So one way to do this is to think about creating a minimum value proposition, which is the minimum that will help your stakeholders in supporting what their needs are from a delivery perspective. Define the MVP with your stakeholders to help them understand the value proposition that you will deliver based on existing resources, based on your existing cost availability and your requirements. It's something you can start small and grow as your team or budget grows, and it needs to be measurable. For example, at the moment with one of our clients, they have identified about a dozen key themes that they need to address to improve the way that they run their department. So what we've done is taken those themes, broken them down into problems, and then we've used those problems and we've created miniature teams that are all working on one of those problems. Now, we've helped the client understand that the main part of what we're going to do is based on their specific budget. We can't possibly do everything because they don't have the time, the resources, the budget. And so by creating a minimum value proposition rather, and saying to your customer, these are the 3, 4, 5, whatever it is that you can afford to do with your resources and your budget. This is really good when you're only given, for example, set up a PMO and told I've only got one other resource to support, and then expected to deliver the work the size of a $50 million portfolio. It may not always be possible. So coming up with a minimum value proposition and agreeing that with your stakeholders upfront, and then over time adding things to it as you get more budget, more capacity, and more maturity. So when you're looking for improvement opportunities and they can form your MVP, put in place a way to identify them. And the way that you can do that is by refocusing, taking a pause right now. We're in a really good time where we can pause and actually think about what are the parts of our project, your PMO, your department, your business, and review each part of that function and ensure that all of the activities that are being performed today are not only relevant, but they're also focused. If you do that assessment, if you do that review, it will help you identify a list of things that need to change. Now, you can use a project tracking tool like MS Project to list these out. You can use Excel, whatever you want to use to track the cost associated with that change, because after all, your time is valuable and your time costs something. And then also the effort associated. So when you go sit down with your customer and you're trying to help them understand the minimum value proposition, you have this list and you can clearly see the effort and the cost associated. Helping a customer see that, for example, we identified one customer was completing 40 different status reports a month. 40 a month on a $25 million program is absolutely absurd. When we started categorizing those reports and adding up the cost and the effort associated with creating and presenting them, they ended up agreeing to reduce that to 5. They can only do that by using metrics. And using metrics will help you also to measure your progress. Exceeding your stakeholder expectations by using regular, intermittent feedback loops. Build your relationships not only within the team or the silo that you're in, but across the enterprise. Be friends with HR, be friends with finance, be friends with internal audit, be friends with risk. Create relationships in those areas because you will need them. That'll help your project teams to remove bottlenecks by you liaising with those organizational departments. And it helps to streamline your processes as well because you're reusing, not recreating. And then think about creating advocates for your PMO so that they can support your executives as well. Iterative implementation planning. Now, what that basically means is creating a step-by-step approach to making change. Now, iteratively could mean as simple as a once-a-week change. One client of ours at the moment is making a change every month, and we've picked a couple of key areas and we're running sprints. And in those sprints, they've picked half a dozen problems that they're going to address in every 4-week period. If you create an environment of iterative implementation planning and you've defined your MVP, it will help your stakeholder to understand the value proposition that you're going to deliver based on the existing resources, the costs, and their requirements. It also will help you to build consistency in your approach, in your processes, and in your requirements. We did this and helped the customer stay on budget by only focusing on what was important for them at the time. Because unless you categorize it and list it and centrally manage it, everybody wants everything and you just can't possibly make all that change all at once. And number 5, proactively demonstrating value. By far my favorite one. People are not mind readers. They're often really, really busy, just like you. And if you don't proactively demonstrate value, then you will be lost and forgotten. And your PMO will be lost and forgotten. And it will not be a first thought when they're doing cost cutting and budget reductions or budget planning for the following year. You'll find that this tiny little amount of money that's shoved over here, and that's for PMO stuff. So you need to avoid that by being able to proactively demonstrating value. And you can do that in a number of different ways. First of all, you can define the value proposition, as I mentioned, and then use that particular process or that approach or that report, whatever it is that you've created, and test it. Test it with your stakeholders. You might use measurements such as the speed of which resources are onboarded. For example, improve the onboarding process. You might find that you onboard someone in maybe 3 days as opposed to 2 weeks. True story. Or some companies I've seen, their onboarding process takes 4 to 6 weeks. If you can reduce that to 2 weeks, well, you're going to make the project managers and the other managers very happy. Train your PMO. So spend time upskilling not just yourself, but people around you as well. There's limited external support can actually inhibit your PMO's ability to grow. So by not having any external influence on what you're doing can actually be more detrimental because then you're recycling the same ideas. Show, don't tell. Another one of my favorites. Use various techniques such as showcases, Kanbans, reporting, newsletters, direct conversations with stakeholders. If you're not getting constant positive feedback, it's time to reevaluate. Because without showing, not telling your stakeholders what it is that you're delivering and how it benefits them, they're going to forget. They're not going to find value in it if they can't see the value firsthand. I find that doing a monthly showcase, for example, for those that have a smaller team, to demonstrate the new processes that the PMO has evolved, improved, refined, or refreshed is a really good way of bringing your stakeholders on board. Yes, not everyone can attend, but there is an opportunity there to actually bring them into the conversation by maybe recording it, or at the moment, a lot of these are happening online through virtual meetings as well, so people can watch them later. Communicate often. Probably one I don't need to explain, but as I said, people get quite lazy when they set up a PMO. Unless you are continuously improving and evolving it, it will not be helpful for anyone. So take the time, don't rest on your laurels, and actually try to communicate often and take the time to evolve and think about what you can do. Just start with baby steps. So how can PMOs work in closer alignment to delivery and organizational objectives? Well, now that we understand what we can do to generate significant value with some practical steps to apply, how do we take an enterprise lens, thinking about it from an organizational perspective? The way you do that is you connect the dots. When you think about PMO, don't think about it as a standalone function in its own silo. Think about how the PMO can evolve to support functions like HR and finance. Projects are temporary, project management is not. And there's a lot of value that you could bring from a project management perspective to other parts of the organization who typically have no involvement within the PMO usually, and actually create yourselves more advocates in the process. PMOs, as I said, don't sit high enough to instigate strategic change. And so they need to make sure that they are thinking about how governance, as I mentioned at the beginning, doesn't start and stop with delivery. It's something that covers across the value chain. So if you are working on risk processes and you liaise with risk, if you're working on HR processes, engage HR. If you if your project get internal audited, understand what that process is and then put a process in place to apply that so you can support the projects in that approach going forward. Because that ultimately governance from top to bottom is synergistic. It's supposed to be from top to bottom synergistic, regardless of what part of the organization you're in. We're all trying to meet the same ultimate strategic objectives and the path that the company is trying to take. So it's much bigger than the PMOs themselves. And another one I didn't mention is taking away the noise. So whenever your projects are complaining about something, try to understand what they're complaining about. There's usually a deeper meaning to it, and there's usually some noise that they might be facing. Remember, project managers don't need to spend all day in Ariba or the other purchasing software and processing purchase orders when someone in the PMO probably can do that in 5 minutes. So think about things that create noise for those delivery teams. I will send a link to everybody in the AMO white paper series. You can see that link on your screen now. Just to close out on that, I'm going to answer some questions that have come through the Slido question. If you also have not had a chance to send a question through, feel free to send it in the text box as well. But just looking at some of the questions that have come through. So, one of the questions that's come through that has come from Raina. Raina said, the old title of project manager appears to be being replaced with Agile project manager. Is there even such a thing? Is there even such a title? This one is really dependent on the specific organizations themselves, because at the moment it seems to be anything goes. People are calling functions that are PMOs that are working in Agile teams Agile PMOs. They're calling Agile project managers instead of calling them Scrum Masters. Depending on what method or approach that they're following, there's no hard or fast rule on what you can or can't call. I think that ultimately, regardless of whether you're a PMO or a project manager, you should be Agile in terms of agility. And so therefore, you don't really need to include that in your title. But if you are specifically rolling out a Agile framework or a method such as SAFe, etc., they do have predetermined role titles and things like that. So really, I don't think it's a matter of whether or not they exist. It's just what's suitable for that organization. Another question from Hassan. If one is unable to secure executive level support for establishment of a PMO or an EPMO, is it deemed a lost battle, or do you think it could continue to thrive? Very, very good question. So one of the biggest observations in our research, which is evident in a number of different studies, is that executive level support is absolutely critical. Now, it sounds like from your question that perhaps there isn't a PMO in place and you're trying to request that one maybe get set up. I think that if you take the opportunity to actually put together a business case for what that PMO could look like, and as I mentioned, start with the minimum value proposition. Think about what are the minimum, 2 or 3 things that you could do to suggest the introduction of a PMO. And one of those things is identifying some of the problems that the project or the wider project teams are facing, and identifying how those can be addressed by similar to a PMO function, regardless of what you want to call it. I think that there is definitely an opportunity to thrive after it's been established, but in order to get it set up, you do need an executive to back you. And I think if you can use some case studies and some of the research perhaps in our white paper around the value that can come from having one, it might help you. But ultimately, if you think about putting a business case on a page and then presenting that in a showcase format, we can talk through that scenario. That might help you get it over the line. So there was a question earlier around, is the PMO that we are discussing here or just governance and support? Well, at the beginning, I was mentioning that PMO is the term that is most widely used globally, but ultimately PMO can also be referred to as project support office, portfolio governance office. It could be called absolutely anything you can think of. PMO is just the one that is most well known, and hence what I'm referring to actually does cover governance and support as well. Another question's just come through, though many organizations are moving to Agile methodologies, they're still likely to find themselves, depending on teams, using the waterfall approach. 100% accurate. Majority, I would say 70 to 80% of the clients that I've engaged with over the last 4 years have said that they are Agile. And although they've tried to introduce elements of Agile, they are still fundamentally waterfall. For example, when you look at the budgeting side of things and the way that organizational budgets take place, while that approach there is continuously waterfall, the way they release funding to projects is continuing to be waterfall. The way that they get approvals on projects to go live is continuing to be waterfall. So it's not, I think, too dissimilar to what's actually happening. Not many organizations are at the maturity level that they need to be to really be truly agile, because it involves releasing that control, which is what waterfall gives people. Hassan has said, digitization is a key theme across many businesses and industries. Will this impact ePMO business models to help deliver online support remotely? Very good question again. I think this is a really interesting one, because I think there's two parts. I've had people say to me, oh, the PMO is going to be dead because they're going to put everything into PPM and it's going to be online and you won't need people. That's not true. I really don't believe that's true in any sense of the word. You'll see that majority of what I covered today is around stakeholder management, communication, feedback, showcases. They're not things that can be replaced by a technology. A technology is not going to go and ask your stakeholders necessarily what they need to, see the value in what you're providing. But what I think is definitely happening is that PMOs need to get a little bit more evolved in their use of digital tools. And I'm seeing a very high increase in PPM, project portfolio management software, that's coming up, and those software is going to help the PMO to be more effective if they use it well. And so I think that digitization, and we wrote a whole article of this on our website about digital in the PMO, is definitely an opportunity for the PMO, not something that I would say is a negative thing to consider about. So another question's come through. Not every project will go agile or safe. Some projects still need PMBOK. How does the PMO adopt where it needs to deal with a couple of frameworks? Very good question from Jagan. So this is where I mentioned, don't create your framework based on a delivery methodology. PMO are not delivery teams. Yes, we do work and we deliver things, but it's not a project. A PMO is an ongoing function that supports, unless you're a program PMO and you're just supporting one program to its completion, ultimately your framework should be scalable and flexible enough that it can support regardless of the methodology that your project manager wants to use. For example, one of our engagements involved project managers that used SAFe as an agile methodology, and they used, others were using waterfall. So what we had to do in the PMO is work out how we integrated information from the different tools that they were using, such as Jira and Confluence for the Agile team, and SharePoint from the Waterfall team, and how we bring that information together in a way that helped us to do what we needed to do, and that was our reporting and other activities. So I think that the PMO itself needs to think about what is the inputs and outputs from those project teams that are delivering using those methods, and focusing on the things that are going to drive the greatest value for the majority of the team, as opposed to trying to match what delivery is doing just work out how you can synergize what you're trying to do for your PMO with delivery teams, as opposed to trying to address and solve everything. Just looking at another comment, I think it looks like a comment that's come through from Erwin. So cooperation and communication between teams, regardless of methodology, is the key to success. Absolutely spot on. Absolutely agree with you completely. So I've covered, looks like, majority of the questions, if not all of them. So just to kind of get to closing, now it's about actually moving forward and actually moving to the change. As I said, you'll all have opportunity to have access to the white paper link, which will give you access to the full white paper, which you can read in your spare time. I do have a book that I will be writing, that I am writing at the moment. So if you want to get more information on that, the link, a second last link there, will help you to stay connected, and I can give you updates on that. For anyone that's interested in getting support within their organisation to facilitate the change, we can do that with our workshops, which are as little as 1 to 5 days, or for larger organisations, in 4 to 12 weeks programs sometimes. So if you want any information on that, feel free to connect with me at the contact@agilemanagementoffice.com, and also follow me on LinkedIn. Other than that, that's pretty much brings us to the conclusion of our webinar. If you enjoyed it, I just ask that you please leave a recommendation on LinkedIn for myself. That's always very helpful. I really, really appreciate any feedback there. You can also write a post on LinkedIn, or you can subscribe to the Agile Ideas podcast as well. Finally, if you want to know anything else or you have any more questions, please do reach out, and thank you for your positive feedback on the presentation. We're always looking to improve and grow and develop. Other than that, I hope you have an amazing day. Thank you everyone for your kind feedback, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.